welcome everyone. In case you might have gotten lost amongst the various hallways of this convention, you are about to hear fantasy on my spaceship, blending science and sorcery. And so, if you're in the wrong place, please move or stay. I mean, we're cool. You should stay with us. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, then I will introduce myself, and then we will jump straight into question times. I will, you can ask questions at any time. I will try to keep track of them in the chat and save them for the end. We will try to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at least for questions from the audience at the end. But otherwise, I have lots of questions, so we're good to go. So don't feel like you're on the spot, anybody. All right. We will go in alphabetical order. Bogey, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Oh, okay, there we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Bogi Tokac, and I have they, them, or em, er, themselves pronouns. Both are equally fine. I'm a writer, a poet, and a critic, and I love science fiction in all of these aspects. And my short story collection, The Trans Space Octopus Congregation, which was a finalist for the Lambda Award, and which I have right here. It has a big octopus on it. Also has science fantasy stories, quite a few of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, and Tobias.
Hi, I'm Tobias Buckel. I'm a Grenadian-born science fiction fantasy author. I've written 11 novels that have been published, 120 short stories that have been published in various places. Lucky enough to be translated into 19 different languages and edited 3 anthologies, and I've done a few other bits and bobs here and there as well. And I'm delighted to be here as the prose guest of honor, which is was very, very kind of everyone to ask me to be. So excited to be here.
We are excited to have you. I am Valerie Valdez, your moderator for this panel. I am the author of Chilling Effect, Prime Deceptions, and the forthcoming Fault Tolerance, all space opera, found family stuff. And I am also published poet and short fiction writer. But let us jump straight into our space fantasy questions here. I will start with, what are some science fantasy works you've enjoyed, and what about them do you find compelling or enjoyable? And we'll start with Bogey again on this one.
Yes, lately I have really enjoyed the confluence of science fantasy and new weird type of stuff, where people try to reconceptualize a classic cosmic horror, and often try to do this by bringing in spaceships and stuff like that. So something like Ada Hoffman's The Outside, or I have also really liked along these lines. I have noticed that there's quite a few works which use mathematics as a stand-in for some kind of magic, or use magic as some kind of mathematics, for example, Yoon Lee's recent trilogy did this quite a lot, which I really enjoyed. And I also always like to go back to earlier works and read the classics of science fantasy, some of which have aged surprisingly well, others not so much. And then I think I would also like to hear from Tobias.
Yeah, take it away, Tobias.
Yes.
So I was muting because I'm typing away because I was just double checking something.
Sure.
You just said Yoon Lee's. Was that the I was trying to find the title for it. Can you refresh me? Is that the one that always has every letter from the one person to the other that ends in yours in calendrical heresy?
Yes.
What's the title of that?
Machineries of Empire.
Yes. That is a fantastic. Yeah. That is some of the most innovative and imaginative science fantasy, science fiction, whatever you want to call it, that I've read in years. Yes. I loved it. That was amazing. Just masterful.
Yes.
In terms of the classics, I'm thinking of the Dying Earth series. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
Jack Vance or Jack Dan, one
Mm-hmm.
of the Jacks from the old
There's
days.
Vance, I think, yeah.
And the Dying Earth really is something I still kind of fall into when I go back and grab it. I really like it because when I was starting out as a younger author, I was very kind of rigid in my hierarchies, like science fiction, fantasy, no overlap. But very silly, being that I come from the Caribbean, where we love to grab things, mix them up, combine them, and push them out in some kind of new form. And so a lot of my favorite pieces of Nalo Hopkinson and Karen Lord's work are inherently science fantasy, right? When you look at something like Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord, that is like one of
Yes.
the great, I think of it as a classic piece of science fantasy that will be in print forever and ever, amen, because it's just so, so solid. And then some of the other titles that jump out at me, I think of as kind of like industrial fantasists. I'm really interested in how Joe Abercrombie has been taking his grimdark up to the Industrial Revolution. I've really been fascinated by like the trader Baru Cormorant, exploring sort of colonialism and technology and fantasy all at the same time. And some of Robert Jackson Bennett's pieces. Oh shoot, I'm blanking on the title again.
Like City of Stairs, City of
Yes, the City of Stairs is
Waves. Yeah.
exactly. City of Stairs is like this inherently sort of like science fantasy milieu that I thought was really striking when I was reading it. So I coined a term for it, industrial fantasy, that just keeps, smokestacks and magic, right?
Yeah, and so speaking of some of these things, and this is something that Bogey had brought up in pre-panel discussion, how has science fantasy evolved over time, and how are the modern stories building on or breaking with those earlier traditions? And normally I would swap and let Tobias start first, but actually since Bogey brought this up, I'm gonna make Bogey do it. Sorry.
Okay, I will try. Yeah, so I was thinking about this kind of like mathematical magic theme and trying to go back to like which earlier works had something like this. And David Zindel's Neverness came to my mind, which has like some absolutely fascinating spellbinding writing and wonderful world building, and it's also really misogynist in places. So I was like, and that made me realize that science fantasy as like a genre or subgenre hasn't really had like a reckoning with these issues, unlike I feel like cosmic horror is undergoing this right now, where people are really grappling with Lovecraft's heritage and his frankly really racist work, and trying to explore how this relates to the history of the subgenre. But I couldn't really think of anything like this about science fantasy. And also something that really struck me is that a lot of science fantasy works, even like modern classics, are which are by marginalized people, are more categorized like under their marginalization than as science fantasy. This struck me when I was reviewing classic works of queer SFF, and a lot of these are science fantasy. Or yeah, let's like one of my favorites, and a lot of these have like really epic feel, and would definitely be like touchstones for the genre, like uh, uh, like Andrea Hairstone's Mindscape, or works like that, which really have like these broad sweeping tableaus of both science and magic, and but I don't really see like the genre reconceptualized to include works like this, or just to have it be associated with something more recent, because I think the genre is absolutely coming back into fashion in like the past 5 years or so, which I'm really excited by. Yes, so Tobias.
I mean, I can't argue that. I think we're pretty much on the same page
Yeah.
as far as that. I'm really curious to see where it goes. I love some of the
Yes.
boundaries And I think part of the reason why it has escaped that is because I think science fantasy never started out as a distinct subcategory. It was always the case of the earlier writers were not melding science fiction and fantasy on purpose. Science fiction and fantasy were extracted out of the primordial ooze of our genre, right? As they're working as as they're pumping out it, because every once in a while I go back and I read some really old work that I remember encountering when I was a kid. And I just realized how much we codified science fiction in the 70s, 80s, and 90s versus prior to that, because I'll read something and it'll be like, oh, this is a science fiction classic. And it's deep in the science fiction, guardrails. And you're like, they've got psi powers. Campbell, you moron. So it's sort of like it's like, yeah, this is hard science fiction, but you've got someone using their brain to like teleport themselves around. Like, yeah, it was a mess. It was a mess. And out of that, I think we codified and made hierarchies and kind of said, well, this is science fiction and this is fantasy, and those things hardened. And prior to that, no one knew what science fiction was. So it's just sort of like, yeah, screw it. You'll fall asleep on a cave and wake up in Mars. Why not? Now we have these, now that we are trying to like break down these hierarchies and mess with them, we're now having to look at that and say, oh, there's such a thing as science fiction and fantasy. But I don't think a writer working in 1937 would have been like, I'm writing science fantasy.
Yeah, even something like Silverberg's Madripoor stuff, it's like that's clearly blurring lines in terms of what it's dealing with.
Right.
And then today we get stuff like, well, I mean, I'm wearing my Guardians of the Galaxy shirt, but Thor, I think, is even actually a better example, the way that they're trying to technologize the magical stuff there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so speaking of that, actually, that leads very well into our next question, which is how do you approach blending science and fantasy when you're planning on writing a science fantasy story? And I'm going to put Tobias on the spot for that one.
Oh, brutally and as much as you want. The further along I get in my writing journey, the more I'm sort of just like, there are no rules. There are no rules, right? There's no such thing. I mean, you can write a story out of a shopping list, right? I mean, there's no such thing as any one thing that has to be done. And so what it is, it's how much of what is it you're trying to do and how much of it do you want to do, and whether or not you can convince readers, to go along with you on the ride. That's the only rule there really is, right? Is everyone willing to come along with you? And so, yeah, I read in some ways like an older SF fan sometimes, because sometimes I'll pick up a book and it's just sort of like, what? They've got spaceships and now there's a unicorn casting spells to teleport them to another planet. Like, you know what? No, I'm not going to do it. Dang it. But that's kind of like that's premature, angry old man with a cane kind of yelling, get off my lawn, in me. And I've discovered, lots of wonderful books meddle with it. And, the more you read of it, the more you realize that actually it's not that I don't like science fantasy or the blurring of the genres. It's just that I like this writer when they do it, and I don't like this writer when they do it. And that's it. That's what you learn a lot about literature, is that you can't make a sweeping generalization based on a handful of things that kind of made you think X. And so one of the titles I'm thinking of that got me more interested in purposeful blurring of it was The God Engines by John Scalzi. If you've ever read this, most people know John Scalzi for being humorous, tongue-in-cheek, arch, clever. It's Scalzi's very, very Scalzi hard, right? But The God Engines, some people dismiss John for being too light, for not writing like, hard SF or whatever it is that they're hoping to get, and John doesn't care. He's doing just fine writing what he's writing. But The God Engines was a book, when I picked it up, where I looked at it and said, I read it was blown away by it, really liked it. And I said, you know, Scalzi's capable of writing anything he wants, right? Because this is a dark piece of grim science fantasy, right? Where the setup is basically, just to ruin it for you, there are starships in the future. They're powered by chaining gods in the engine room, right? To draw their power to get faster than light travel, right? And John basically runs with that. And so it's not your normal kind of like, oh, I read this and I laughed every, you know, few paragraphs. No, it's really well done. Not that his other stuff isn't well done. That's not what I'm saying at all, please. But like it's a very different Scalzi than you're used to. And it shows that he has mastery of a lot of different forms of science fiction. And when you read his short stuff, you can see that as well. And so that was a piece of science fantasy that actually convinced me to actually go looking for more of it because I liked God Engines so much. I've never even told John this, by the way.
John's definitely watching, and now he knows.
Yeah, John, hi. But I liked it so much that actually that launched me into looking for some more.
Bogey.
Yes, I would also briefly return to what both of you said about histories and reading earlier work, and about like the blurring of categories. Is that I think quite a lot of it in American SFF, at least, or English language SFF, is due to Campbell being a really big fan of psi powers and explicitly asking for not just for psi powers, but a specific kind of story where the psi powered people are kind of nice, benign Superman. And I remember that Philip K. Dick disliked this so much that he wrote like the anti-story of this, where the psi-powered people are like total jerks. So and of course it wasn't published by Campbell because Campbell would have had I don't know, he would have been very upset, but I think he was still. But one thing that I really like is like to read a bit not just into the works but their context. Like, for example, when it comes to Campbell and his like almost religious beliefs about this type of stuff, Alec Novala Lee has a really cool book about the histories of Astounding and the people around it. And he really doesn't shy away from, how do I say, like, I wouldn't say controversial stuff because pretty much all of it is controversial, but the ones that fans, including maybe myself, also won't necessarily like to remember that these are like parts of the history of the genre. For me, it's also tricky because I grew up reading SFF in Hungarian, which was a good chunk of it was translated from English, but another good chunk of it was translated from Russian, which had a very, very different approach to both these types of things and also the blending of subgenres. And then Hungarian SFF kind of like was like developing in like the shadow of these influences. But to me, primarily, I started combining science fiction and fantasy elements in my own work because I'm a scientist, I'm a health sciences researcher, and so I wanted to write about write what you know. Here, I'm going to write about what I know. But also, I wanted to write about magic. So these kinds of things kind of combined in my head. And it's really funny because depending on like the reader, some people read these as total fantasy and other people read it as hard SF. And it's probably both. So that also happens.
That means you did a good job blending it though, right? Like if everybody is complaining about it or if nobody is complaining about it, either way,
Yes.
that means you did a good job.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think that then leads into our next question, which is, so when you are considering where to draw the line between science and fantasy, are there particular elements that you consider, or you just ignore the existence of the line to begin with? And we'll let Bogey start with that one.
Yeah, I feel like I often have a concept in mind that I want to write about, and sometimes it's more science related, sometimes it's more fantasy related. I always try to research both sides of it if I'm writing something like that. Like, for example, I would read like the history of occultism and that type of stuff, because I feel like I want to keep kind of both aspects grounded and thorough, because I feel like I don't want to be using either genre, elements from either genre is kind of like a cop out, like, oh, I don't know what to do with this problem, here, let's bring a spaceship, or oh, I don't know what to do with this problem, magic. Like, I mean, that's like a classic solution. So I don't want to do that, but usually I start with something specific, and I like to start with two different something specific and then see how I can mash those up.
Because it's kind of an X meets Y. It's like we're gonna have this thing, and then we're gonna
Mhm.
put them together and see what comes out of it.
Yeah.
Cool, cool. Tobias?
I just was double checking two more recommendations, right, to show you just how, like, because I'm seeing like in the Discord the excitement people are having over title suggestions, and that's always terrifically fun. So like we're talking about how, like, you know, the hierarchies of science fiction, and so you go to someone like Peter Watts, who writes the hardest of the hardest of the hardest science fiction. And just don't ever forget that, like in Blindsight, his novel, like one of the characters is an actual honest to God vampire. It's not so much science fantasy, but like, again, it's playing with that, you know, that line and messing with it. And
Or starfish, it's basically mermaids. That's
exactly. And then the other one that really had a big impact on me when I was in high school was C.S. Friedman's The Madness Season, which is a book that is about an alien race invading Earth. So it's space opera. It's that grand sweeping space opera, resistance space opera, that I really loved. But the main character is a part of a family of vampires that hides in the shadows of human history and gets found out by the overlord aliens, and basically has to jumpstart a human resistance in order to sort of save vampiredom. And so it's like massive spaceships and alien civilizations and faster than light travel and vampires all in one. It's like if Anne Rice were to write like a you know, Star Wars themed setting type thing and just mash all that together. One of my favorite books when I was in high school. Don't tell me if it doesn't hold up anymore. I don't want to know. I have not read it in years. But you know, as a writer myself, I'm looking for things that complicate the story and complicate the characters' lives. I think we made a really good point about, like, you're not using it as a Deus ex machina. You're using it as an evil writer to make your character's life more hellish, right? So if you're a human, what seems to be a human being invaded by aliens and abducted and taken to space, and realizing that, like, it's going to be hard to maintain your vampire side life amongst these alien conquerors, and suddenly it's not about that being easy for the character. It's about their life just got like radically more complicated, and the fantasy makes their life more complicated. And that's, like, I think really next level storytelling. And I think that's one of the reasons that sits, you know, so much in my brain as being one of those great examples of science fantasy for me, because it adds complication, which as a writer you want, because then characters have to make those hard choices, make those difficult decisions, and every time they make a compromised decision, then the second knock-on effects make their lives more complicated. So now, you know, it's not just a case of like this poor character, you know, trying to hide as a vampire among the alien invasion. You know, now he's trying to stand up a revolution so he can maintain his blood supply. Because those pesky aliens have ruined everything.
I'll actually add to the pile. Ilona Andrews has a series, starts with, I think, Clean Sweep, which is technically urban fantasy, but also is space fantasy because it does have vampires and magic, and the vampires are aliens, and so are the werewolves.
Nice.
Throw it all
Yep.
together.
Yep.
So this is also just kind of part and parcel of what you've just been talking about, but are there then specific things that you think fit more neatly into one category or the other when you're working, like communication devices or vehicles or some sort of form of medical care? Or do you prefer to let the story dictate the world of the story, the characters or what have you dictate that? And we'll start with Tobias for this one.
it's all story, you know,
Mhm.
the story, it's got to start with the story.
Mhm.
And that's kind of that, you know, you kind of start at that point and just spiral your way outwards is kind of how I imagine it.
Mhm.
So I'm looking for, you know, those categories in terms of how they affect the story first. And then I move from there.
Mhm. Yeah, Bogey?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. There is, I feel like, a subtype of science fantasy when people from a kind of science fictional setting go to a planet that is a medieval classic fantasy type of
Mhm.
planet. And uh, Friedman, I was reminded of this by
Mhm.
Tobias's example of Friedman, because she has a trilogy like that, the Cold Fire trilogy,
Yeah.
where people land on a planet where magic is very powerful, and then they end up like their entire civilization changes very abruptly into just trying to defend from the monsters that their own mind evoked. And but there's like quite a bunch of works like this. For example, the Strugatskys have Hard to Be a God, where the characters who are like the very fancy, futuristic space communism type of people end up going to a planet which is like a classic medieval fantasy planet, and then of course. They try to like hide, but they still have their own high technology and things like that. So that is also hard to say. Like it's intended as science fiction, but it has like all the tool set of fantasy, and
Yeah.
sometimes the story might be a straight up fantasy. So I don't know how I would like categorize those. Or another interesting subtype of this is when there's a series and some volumes are science fiction and some volumes are more fantasy, and then some volumes are a mix of the two, the Dyachenkos, who are a Ukrainian husband and wife team, have the Vita Nostra trilogy, where the first volume is urban fantasy, the second volume is very near future SF, and then the third volume is kind of a mix of the two. I think only the first one is available in English so far, but hopefully all of them will be published. So when it comes to my own writing, sometimes I'm like, okay, I could combine these like simultaneously, or I could combine these elements sequentially. Like there's a lot of different possibilities that I can think of that are sort of like forerunners, and that's always cool because I get to read more stuff that I like. So yeah.
And
You immediately made me think of a couple of titles. I think uh, you talked about that kind of high, you know, no magic but medieval fantasy symbols almost. Carl Schrader's novel Ventus begins reading as if it's a fantasy novel. And by about a third of the way through, you begin to realize it's actually space opera hard SF.
mm,
By the end of the book, you're fully into full on space opera hard SF mode. And where you started is so far from where you ended. That experience for me is always one of my favorites, the way that kind of opens up and changes. And then
Yep.
the other, you were talking about different books having different aesthetics. Jack Chalker, Midnight at the Well of Souls series, has all these different worlds that have different, some of them are magic, some of them are high tech. And if I remember the series right, that I loved when I was in high school, that were a blast. So it is like, there's so many ways of doing this, right? You know, again, there are no rules. You just have to convince everyone to come along with you.
Yes.
and so speaking of sources that you draw for inspiration, which Bogey mentioned earlier, and also you're pulling out so many good book recommendations that I assume some of them are partly your inspiration. But what sources do you draw on for inspiration for the scientific or the fantasy elements? But we talked about, you know, work before, which I hope you will elaborate on as well. But we'll start with Tobias this time.
Sure. I draw inspiration. It comes from all over. I mean, that's the fun, right? I've been talking a lot today about research, right? And so for me, that's kind of where it comes from. The research, the poking around, pushing ideas against each other. I did a workshop on creativity today, and I talked a lot about like grabbing stuff you like and breaking it down like Lego into its component Legos, right? You know, you take a spaceship and break it down to all the parts that fascinate you. You know, sweep over the Legos you don't want, keep what you love, put them in the box. Grab everything you like from fantasy,
Mhm.
you know, break it down to just its little bits, put it in the box, shake it up a bit, pull it out, and just start playing. You know, so you know, do you uh, I mentioned in the creativity thing, coming up with the idea for a short story, uh, where I'd been looking at dragons. There'd been an open call for a dragon anthology, and so I had like 3 dragon ideas. But the first idea is never necessarily the best, right? It's just you grabbing what's out there in pop culture and your consciousness and whatever, and it's usually the worst. But I'd written down some of these ideas that were popping into my head of things I could write, but I didn't have time to write for this anthology, so I just was like just getting it out of my head,
Mhm.
like, you know, just like get this down on paper and something will come of it later. But I was researching the history of currency. I was reading David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. I'm
Mhm.
still only about halfway through it after like a year, so it's intense. But I was reading about the history of hard currency and the nature of what money is. And as I was reading it, it got into this side area where I was kind of trying to map crypto to that in my head. So I
Mhm.
started writing down some thoughts about crypto. If money's all a construct and crypto's a construct and blah, 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 I was just mapping these things out in my head. And then I went, wait, there's another jump here. What if you connect, if I'm connecting crypto to gold, what else loves gold? Dragons.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, dragons sitting on a server farm full of crypto keys as a horde now is science fantasy, but like it just blooms, you
Mhm.
know? And then you're like, once you've made that connection, you go, okay, now what else is here? And you start playing. So for me, it's that, you know, it's just looking for these connections and seeing like, okay, does this fantasy thing go with this other thing?
Mhm.
And if it does, it doesn't matter whether it's science fantasy, science fiction, or
Mhm.
fantasy. You know, drawing that connection means I can do something really interesting with hard currency and dragons, and you know, and I get a story called Crypto Draconis, and I'm really happy because I'm like, look, I did something clever. Now I'm gonna share it with the world. Like this idea happened to me, and the short story is almost just an excuse for me to just try to give you that look. This happened to me while I was reading these 3 different things, and now I want to share that feeling with you.
You're like the first person to put mushrooms on a pizza. Okay, I'm assuming everyone likes mushrooms on pizza. You don't have to. But Bogey, what sources do you draw on then for this?
Yes. Yes, since you asked about like specific titles, also about writing about magic, what I really appreciated recently was I was typing because I was like making sure that I get the
Yeah.
title right. So there's 2 books that came to my mind. One is Roger Luckhurst's The Invention of Telepathy,
Mhm.
which talks about how telepathy as a concept itself was basically invented in Victorian England in specifically in 1882 by a specific guy, and he talks about how this concept became so popular and how it related to the technological advancements of the time, the scientific advancements of the time, but also things like ghosts that Victorians loved. So this is one of them, and the other has a long title, so I will like quickly alt tab to quote it accurately. It's called Technologies for Intuition, Cold War Cycles and Telepathic Rays by Elena Limon. And this is an anthropological work where she studies communication and communication breakdowns on like both sides of the Cold War, and how people conceptualize telepathy in different countries. And she goes and talks to for example, talks to Russian theater students about how they think of their influence on the audience, or like all sorts of these aspects, and then pulls these into like a quite broad ethnographic tableau of both the US and Russia. And of course this made me think that here you have like this imperial center and that imperial center, and like Hungary is like a tiny little speck on like compared to these, but it really made me think about like Hungarian attitudes are like both comparable to the Russian and the American, but still distinct from either. And that's probably also because both of these influenced how we think about these things, and also our own cultural traditions, like Hungarian culture is traditionally a shamanic culture, which affects of how these things are conceptualized. So there's all sorts of these interesting things to think about, and some of it makes it into my stories, some of it doesn't. Some of it makes it into my nonfiction writing. Like I wrote recently about translations of Asimov's Second Foundation during communist Hungary, where some bits are like elegantly removed from the text, and I explored exactly what was censored and why. I mean, of course, we can only speculate about the why, but it's possible to like just come to some kind of understanding just based on cultural influences and stuff like that. So everything turns up somewhere. I agree with Tobias that just reading a lot eventually gets us somewhere, and it's also fun.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if my writing is not an excuse to figure out how to monetize my research.
I think that's legit.
Write it off on your
Um,
taxes if you can. Yep.
Yeah,
Yes.
for those of you who were at like some of my other talks when I keep talking about research, I would just say like this conversation here just shows you like every sort of like writer that I spend a lot of time hanging out with who's like at a that I've been around inevitably ends up basically we end up swapping titles. Like
Yep.
I'm Bogey's
Yes.
talking about these titles
Yes.
and fiction and nonfiction. Like it's just I'm gonna go grab The Invention of Telepathy. Like that one,
Yes.
my ears have perked up, and I'm sort of like,
Yes.
okay, I didn't even know this book existed, and I'm not gonna run off and take a look at it and read it and get it on my Kindle.
Yes.
That's what that's the thing, right? That research, that deep reading, that intellectual curiosity of just I don't know if there's anything here or if I'll ever use anything in that book if I read it. But like, who knows? But it sounds really interesting, and that's the game, right? That's the game.
Yeah.
And
I
kind
was
of why would
super.
you keep it all separate? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I was just trying to say that people are putting these things into the Discord, so I think that uh, that's both a wonderful resource and also shows that we are not alone in swapping titles. So that's
yeah,
awesome.
Everyone's leaving here with a very long TBR. Very
Yes.
long. All of us.
This
All
is
of us.
what that's part of what cons are for. I mean, that's not the only thing cons are for, but certainly a part of it.
Oh yeah. And so we are now at 15 minutes out, actually 13 minutes out. So if people want to ask questions, please do get them in now. Put maybe like a big Q in front of it so that I know that you are asking the question. I do have more to ask, so do not feel again like you are on the spot. But now is the time, friends, to get in the audience questions. And so I'm just really quick poking over here. We actually had a couple of questions earlier that I'm going to let's see if one of those. How do you feel about the idea that Star Wars popularized science fantasy in sort of the broader cultural context? Either of you can take that one.
I think about this one a little bit sometimes. Yeah, I think that I don't think it popularized science fantasy. I think most people assume that Star Wars equals science fiction, which means that a lot of people assume science fantasy is a subset of science fiction. When you talk to when you talk to the general population, and I talk about how Star Wars is actually, more fantasy than science fiction in some ways, they're very confused. They don't see that, right? They don't see that. So I don't know if it popularized science fantasy as a genre all in and of itself. I don't think people look at that and think like, oh, I should be looking for more stuff like Star Wars because it's science fantasy and avoiding Star Trek because it's science fiction. Although Star Trek is science fantasy as well, to be honest, right? But I don't think that that's as conscious a delineation as that, to be honest. But I think it goes to show you that the wider audience just doesn't give a crap.
Yeah,
You can
about
write
the
anything you
labels.
want.
Yeah.
It's only like that core community that tries to want to keep hierarchies that goes like, no, this is science fiction and this is fantasy, and never the twain shall meet.
Yes.
Yeah. Bogey, did you want to answer that one or?
No, just add to it that this is also like, I feel like sometimes when it comes to these big series, is that sometimes people try to downplay the fantasy aspects for some kind of respectability. Like they go like, oh yeah, the thing that you watch with the Jedi powers, that's not real science fiction, but the thing I watch with, I don't know, Vulcan mind melding, that's like
Yeah.
real science
Yeah,
fiction.
yeah.
So
Listen, the moment Q showed up in Star Trek: The Next Generation, it was no longer science fiction. And there were other things long before that, but I just remember that for me. And I was a huge fan, but I just remember when Q showed up, I was just like, all right, bleep it. Like, there are no rules. I
At that point,
spent
you
all
can do
this
whatever you
time
want.
trying to come up with books that are like the science of Star Trek and how it could all be exactly real and like making sure that the tubes are all like right and everything like that. And I'm like, it doesn't matter.
That's why I write space opera.
Yep.
Because yes. So actually speaking of that fits into a question I had written down, which is do you like to lean on realism for the technology that we currently have, or do you prefer the challenge of pushing to come up with magical solutions to mundane problems when you're putting these kinds of stories together? Is it do you start with what we already have and kind of work from there, or do you prefer to just like yeet all of that and come up with alternatives? Whoever
You
wants to
went
start that
first
one, yeah.
last time, so I'm not.
Okay, go ahead,
Okay,
Boogie.
yeah. Yeah, one thing that I recently thought more about is assistive technology, because I feel like now that people want to write more inclusive SFF and try to come up with, oh, okay, now I should write more inclusive fantasy as well. They try to come up with these ideas, and of course, this seeps into science fantasy as well. Like I enjoyed Alex White's. Okay, now the title completely.
Oh yeah, it's like
Yeah, a big
yeah,
ship
okay.
at the edge
At
of
the end
the
of the universe,
universe.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, and which has a lot of like very interesting and clueful commentary on this type of topic, and there's quite a few more works that try to engage with some aspect of assistive technology. Uh, like, oh my god, I'm trying to say the name of this series that I just got into, but like I feel like here it's almost 10 p.m., so I'm just going to pretend it's because of that. Witch Hat Atelier, yes.
Oh yes, yes.
Which is straight up fantasy, but deals with a lot of like technologized magic,
Mhm.
which might be like a subcategory of science fantasy. Though this is also the thing that I've heard people call hard fantasy, but I think that just sounds confusing. And now that like people are trying to phase out hard SF as a term, maybe we shouldn't try to adopt hard fantasy as a term either. Um, anyway, I just wanted to remark on how that's super interesting, and how I was just looking at the comments in the
Oh
chat.
yeah, no, no worries.
Yes, about yeah, I have to read this. Tobias says, "Don't Google hard fantasy without safe search on." So yeah, that's probably for the best. Uh, yeah, so that's just like really a small thought that I had. Yes.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing enough love for Witch Hat Atelier in the chat. It's like everybody needs to read that.
Yes.
Anyway, so um, what do you enjoy most? I know this has already been touched on a little bit here, but about mixing science and fantasy together, that is distinct from writing them separately. What is the beauty of the blend as opposed to trying to keep the components apart? Tobias, you want to take that first, or?
Sure. So I think one of the reasons that it's fun to blend is you get to use more tools. So one of the powerful, I always talk about power chords, and one
Mhm.
of the power chords of fantasy is that a lot of symbology of fantasy is readily accessible, right? A lot of kids grow up knowing castles, medieval, dragons, fantasy creatures. There's a lot of symbology that you can tap into and use because it has a weight. that you haven't earned necessarily, but you can use, and is really powerful. And with science fiction, there's it has some other tools, right? What if this is coming, or think about this, and so putting it together means you have access to all of them, and you're not limited to one or the other, right? You can play the power chord, you can have that, in Star Wars, for example, you can play with the older, more wise spiritual leader, and you can use the tropes from those experiences, the tropes of like the mind, and what you have to do to access that power, that magic. And a lot of those stories come out of some deep, deep historical power chords, while also playing with a new symbology of spaceships and rivets and other planets, and frontiers, and these other things. And so you can you get two toolboxes at the same time. It's like I can do carpentry and welding on the same project, right? It could be twice as disastrous. Maybe something cool could happen, twice as cool could happen too.
Yep.
I think you can go twice as wrong and twice as cool at the same time.
Yes, and I think that reminds me of when I think I mentioned this very briefly at the beginning, that when I was starting to read like classic queer SFF, that a lot of it was along the lines of science fantasy. And I think part of it is also like that. I want to have this awesome thing and that awesome thing, and also let's make it queer. So this is how we get magic and spaceships, and now let's make it queer. And I also see this in trans writing, is that like now that people are like, okay, this stuff can actually get published now, then they want to go like, okay, I want to do this and this and this also, and then it's gonna be awesome. So yeah.
I want to have the magic, but I also want to have the robots. I want to have Final Fantasy. I want to have Chrono Trigger. I want to have
dinosaurs.
All dinosaurs.
And I think writers from historically sort of marginalized communities are aware of boundaries and blurring boundaries in a way that maybe a sort of more mainstream individual is not intimately as aware with. So the idea of pushing back, breaking, remixing, and poking at, or trying to create space in those two places is completely natural. I mean, I'm biracial, so I'm constantly thinking about how you straddle multiple worlds. I'm an immigrant. I'm always thinking about how to be a diaspora individual, and so that naturally is not surprising that I also then look at categories and start going like, I think I can put some peanut butter in the chocolate and see what happens.
Delicious is what will happen. So we actually do have an audience question, which is, do you have any recommendations for science fantasy that's science like psychology, botany, and so on merged with fantasy? And somebody brought up Annihilation, and I know Bogey had mentioned how New Weird is sort of filtering into science fantasy in cool ways. But do either of you have recommendations that fit that mold?
Not off the top of my head this second.
Okay.
Well, this is kind of weird for me to answer, because I am a psychologist and a linguist by trade. So, and I do have sciences stuff. So basically, I feel like my writing kind of fits.
Yes.
Not so much on the botany aspect, I'm sad to say, but I'm always trying. And I feel like I'm actually seeing a lot of like forthcoming work. Like I see people tweeting about, oh, I'm writing a book about mushrooms. I'm writing another book about mushrooms. And then there's another person writing a book about mushrooms. So I think that we're going to have a wonderful amount of books about mushrooms, and I feel like Ed Yong and other writers who have written about these kinds of topics are really Holbein. Oh my god, what? I'm sorry. I will put it in the Discord.
Sure.
Who writes about trees in a scientific way, but in a way that's different from what you learned in high school, are really influencing like the current crop of writers. So it shows up faster in short fiction than I actually just got my contributor copy of Xenocultivars, which has botanical and plant-based and queer SFF, but I don't know how much science fantasy because I've only read a couple stories of it so far, but I think that probably fits the bill. It just came out, and I hope to soon finish it and report back. So yeah.
I'm just linking that in the Discord. And so we have about 1 minute left. Let us then do our outros. And if you would not mind just telling everyone where they can find you online, we will be in the Toast channel in the Discord if you want to ask a couple extra questions. Thank you so much, both of you, for this extremely wonderful and TBR expanding panel. So Tobias, would you mind just telling people where you can be found online?
www.tobiasbuckell.com will take you to my website, which has all the infos and also allow you to sign up for your email newsletter if you'd like to once a month get news about what I'm up to. If you are on social media, I'm on Twitter at Tobias Buckell, and I hang out there semi-occasionally, less so this year than past years, but I imagine I'll be back on more over the summer.
Bogey?
Yeah, I am on the most social media and most of anything as Bogey person. I especially recommend my Patreon. And I have a website called bogeyreadstheworld.com, which I sadly haven't been able to update in the past few months, but I hope to be getting back to it very soon. And also see you in the Discord. I'm going to pop over and take a look because I haven't really been able to keep up, but I saw that that there has been quite a bit of discussion. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and it has been a joy, and this was really fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I am your host, Valerie Valdez. You can find me at valerievaldez.com or at Valerie Valdez on Twitter and other social media. Actually, I'm Valerie Valdez author on a couple of them. But anyway, thank you again so much to our panelists. And thank you to our audience members. And we will see you in the Discord.